Hello, I am Dr. Derek H. Lindquist, and I am the Vice Dean of the new Jindal School of Psychology and Counseling that will be opening this fall. It gives me great pleasure to be able to speak to you today, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about psychology and its interdisciplinarity. So to get it started, as most of you probably know, this new school is located within OP Jindal Global University, a relatively young university. We just opened in 2009, but over the past 12 years, the university has really been showered in accolades and recognition. We are highly ranked as one of the top private universities in India and, in fact, around the world. And in 2019, the government of India recognized JGU as an institution of eminence. So the school, or excuse me, the university currently has 9 different schools. The Jindal School of Psychology and Counseling will make the 10th school at JGU. And again, we are currently admitting students, and we will be opening our doors early August 2021. So today, let's start out by basically defining our terms. What is psychology? Now, this is one of those words that most people have heard of. It's probably a little bit more difficult to define precisely what we mean by psychology. So the word or the term psychology comes from the ancient Greek. Psyche means soul or mind. Logos means knowledge or study. So psychology is basically the study of the soul or mind. Now, for present purposes, I will refer to the mind. The soul often has religious connotations associated with it. So really what psychology is it's a study of who we are. What makes us tick? What makes you, you? What makes me, me? So as an exercise, if you would, why don't you just think for a moment about what words or images best describe a psychologist, right? What comes to mind when you think of a psychologist? So I am going to hazard a guess and say that for many of you, it may be a mental health facility, a hospital, or some other place where people are getting care. It could be a clinical psychologist or a counselor where they're meeting with patients. It could be a researcher who is trying to understand the brain, our behavior, and other processes that, again, underlie who we are as human beings. So one thing I do want to emphasize at the outset is psychology is a science. So just like chemistry or biology or physics, psychologists are scientists. We utilize what's called the scientific method. And this is essentially a way to try to get at what is, quote, real or what is true. And so psychology uses the scientific method, which essentially comes down to trying to form a hypothesis, an idea about how humans operate. We can then design an experiment to test that hypothesis. We collect data, we analyze that data, and ultimately we try to either support our hypothesis, or if our data is contraindicated by our hypothesis, we reject it. So psychology is a scientific discipline, and it's really there to study and analyze what we refer to as human mental processes and behavior. So what are mental processes? Well, as you may imagine, these are internal. So these are the things that are going on that are hidden from view. These are your thoughts, your goals, your desires, your feelings, your memories, right? All those things that go on inside of your head, that's what we mean by mental processes. Behavior, on the other hand, is often overt, meaning we can see it, right? So facial expressions, body language, etc. So if we look at the image of this little girl here, right, she is clearly experiencing mental processes, some type of emotion. She seems to be quite happy. And we can see that reflected in her behavior, her facial expression. Now, I do want to be clear that when we refer to behavior, it's a little more broad than just overt actions and reactions. It also refers to actions that may be covert. So changes in physiology, for instance. So if you are angry or afraid, your heartbeat starts accelerating, your breathing gets fast, right? Your pupils dilate. So all those physiological changes, which may not be readily apparent, but we can still measure, we would also lump them under the term behavior. And so ultimately, as psychologists, we're really trying to understand the two of these. We're trying to understand how our mental processes are reflected and expressed through our behavior. So at the outset, we should ask, okay, but why should we study psychology, right? Maybe you're interested in it. Maybe it's your child who's interested in it. So what's the benefit? Well, one of the things psychology does is it evaluates our common beliefs, and it really tries to understand, again, what is true and what may be misconceptions. So let's do another exercise. If you will, you can just think to yourself, or you can talk among yourself if there's a group of you watching, but let's see how well you do. So is this true or false? Memories of everything we've experienced are stored permanently in our brains, even if we can't access them. In fact, we know that this is false. So memories of everything is not stored. There are many mundane experiences that you have. What did you have for dinner last night, for instance? They may be encoded in the short term, but they're not stored in our long-term memory. And even those memories that are stored in our long-term memory, they're not complete representations of the event. They have been edited. They've been modified as a result of the encoding process. So yes, we do have good memories, but our memory is not exhaustive. It does not include everything that we have experienced. Number two, the more people present in an emergency, the more likely that at least one person will help. Once again, we know this is false. And sort of the classic example of this is a woman named Kitty Genovese. She was murdered in New York City in the 1960s. It was right outside several apartment buildings. There were dozens of people that observed this happening. She was brutally beaten and killed, but not a single person called the police. Why? Because the people watching knew they were not alone. They knew other people were watching. And so when we're in a group and we see an emergency, it leads to what we call diffusion of responsibility. Essentially the idea that I don't need to do anything because somebody else will. Surely somebody else will call the police. There's no reason for me to get involved. So what we know is you're actually more likely to assist the fewer the number of people available or present at the time of the emergency itself. Number three, people with schizophrenia have more than one personality. So that is also false. Now, originally, when schizophrenia was defined well over 100 years ago, they called it, they thought of it as a sort of a split mind, different personalities. We now no longer think of schizophrenia that way. And in fact, the defining characteristic of schizophrenia is a break from reality. We call it psychosis. So they may experience hallucinations or delusions, a delusion being believing in something that's demonstrably not true. And so people with schizophrenia do not have more than one personality per se. And again, that's not the criterion that we use to diagnose and treat schizophrenia today. All right, final example. Most people only use about 10% of their brains. Well, you may notice a common theme here. This is also false. So a little background about me. I am a psychologist, but my specialization is in what we call behavioral neuroscience, meaning I'm interested in the biological side of psychology. How does the brain operate? And so this is something I've heard many, many, many times over my career. And again, it's simply patently false. So think of it this way. Your brain is about 3% of your body's overall mass, but it consumes over 20% of the body's energy. It's a tremendous resource. It just sucks up energy. So there's simply no way that Mother Nature would have designed it to only use 10%. And in fact, we know that all of your brain is used in every person. Even if you were born blind or deaf, for instance, those brain regions devoted to vision and hearing do not simply go unused. They will actually be taken over by adjacent brain regions. So every part of your brain is utilized. This common misconception that only 10% of our brain is used is just that. It's a misconception. It's false. So again, this is one of the real key roles of psychology, is to not rely on what may seem common sense or sort of the quote truth. Rather, psychology investigates, it researches, it tries to get to the core of the argument and find out whether that is true or not. So these are all clearly misconceptions. So secondly, why should you or your child study psychology? Well, psychology aims to describe behavior. So how do we behave? And we know this changes over development, for instance. So children behave differently than teenagers, who behave differently than adolescents. We try to explain behavior. What are the reasons? What are the causes behind the way that we act? And if we can explain behavior, that gives us insight into perhaps being able to predict behavior. So based on learning mechanisms, perhaps, we can understand how people learn and how they may change their behavior as a result. And then in many cases, if our behavior is aberrant, or if an individual is suffering from some type of mental illness, as psychologists, we may aim to change the behavior, or at least modify the behavior in adaptive ways for the individual. So this leads to the question of, well, what types of questions are investigated in psychology? So here, this is not exhaustive, but just a few examples for fun. So one is, again, looking at how we experience the world. So we have 5 senses, as everyone is familiar. Those senses come at us. Right now, you can perhaps see me, you can at least hear my voice. And so all of that information goes through your sensory receptors, through your eyes, your ears, your skin, etc. And it is transformed into what we call a perception. So we perceive the world. We don't necessarily experience those sensations directly. We perceive the world based on how our brain interprets the outside world. So right now, I can see my coffee cup, I can smell my coffee, and I can taste my coffee. So the sensations of sight, smell, taste are then what we call transduced. That's the technical term. But those sensations are transduced then into the perceptions that we experience. And just to show you that perception is not necessarily the same as sensation, if you look at this picture here, you can see the 2 blocks, A and B. So clearly A is a dark gray, B is a light gray, right? Clearly different. But are they? This is the exact same image. I've simply removed the surrounding image, the picture. And wow, look at that. A and B are identical to one another. So why do we perceive B as lighter? Well, it really goes over to this green cylinder. If you can see, there's light on the right side. It's projecting a shadow onto the B square. So our brain interprets that and it perceives that B square as lighter. But in fact, they are identical. They are identical in terms of the actual sensation. What is altered is our perception. So see this again. On the left, you can see the blue square on the bottom. On the right, you can see the pink square on the top. But again, if we remove all the surrounding imagery, we find that they are actually identical to one another. So I really like stuff like this because, again, it's just kind of trippy. It shows that our perceptions are not necessarily identical to the sensation. Our brain is interpreting the world. Our brain is making predictions of what it should perceive based on, again, not just the squares themselves, but the surrounding image. On the left, you can see it's surrounded by this red background. On the right, it's a green background. And so again, our brain perceives those 2 blocks differently. So another example is attention. right? What is attention? How does attention operate? Well, really, it's our ability to focus, to pay attention, if you will. So as an example, let me show you a quick little video here. So if you'll watch this with me. Good. So if you got 15 as your answer, perfect. You were able to observe and count, and obviously you had to pay attention to the ball. But there's a bigger question here. How many of you saw the gorilla? And some of you are going, what? Wait. And there he is, right smack dab in the middle of your screen. All right, now this is a famous psychology experiment. We know that approximately 1/3 of viewers are simply going to miss the gorilla. They don't see it at all. But again, if you look, right, it's right there. Your eyes are clearly seeing it. That image is being processed in your visual pathways, but you're not paying attention. Your attention is focused on the ball, and so you simply do not observe it. You do not attend to it. So once again, it goes to show that sensation, the input of visual information to your eyes, is not the same as our perception. And so the way we think of attention is it's like a spotlight in a dark room, right? We can't pay attention to everything. Our attention is limited, is finite. And so as that spotlight moves around, that is our attention. But there's lots of information, lots of things that are occurring outside of the spotlight that we simply are unaware of because we're not able to attend to it. So how about intelligence? Now, 100 years ago, it was thought that there was one type of intelligence, right? Intelligence, our definition in psychology has changed over the years. Beginning in the 60s, it began to be recognized that there's actually two different types of intelligence. We have what's called crystallized intelligence. So this is basically the facts and knowledge that you know. So if you know, for instance, that Portuguese is spoken in Brazil, right? That's a piece of knowledge about the world that you know. We would consider that to be crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence, on the hand, is our ability to think and reason, to think abstractly. So if you're good at puzzles, for instance, that would be an example of fluid intelligence. And so while there is interaction between these two types of intelligence, we also know that they operate independently of one another. Now, as we move forward up into the late 90s and early 2000s, psychologists began to recognize that even this was too limited, that in fact, there are many types of intelligence out there. So we now refer to this as multiple intelligence, the theory of multiple intelligence. And so here's just one example. Bodily kinesthetic. So think of an athlete or someone who has really exquisite control of their body, right? We can think of that as a type of intelligence. Musical intelligence, your ability to play music if you have perfect pitch, right? Logical mathematical. So if you're really good at mathematics or numbers or statistics, again, that is an intelligence unto itself. Interpersonal. Inter means between. So these are people that are really good at recognizing the emotional states of others, understanding people's motivations and why they behave the way that they do. We sometimes refer to this as emotional intelligence. Intrapersonal intelligence, understand, refers to yourself, understanding your own emotions, your own drives, your own desires, your own beliefs. Linguistic intelligence. So some people are just naturally adept at learning languages. So again, we can think of that as an intelligence unto itself. Spatial intelligence. So if you are an artist, for instance, or a graphic designer, if you're really good at being able to visualize the world, Again, that's a type of intelligence. And one that's actually just been added more recently, and this has a little bit more of a historical context, and this is what we call naturalist intelligence. So you can think of our historic past, right? 30, 40, 100,000 years ago, we had hunter-gatherers. So the ability to live in the wild, to live in nature, to recognize which plants you can eat, which may have medicinal value, which are dangerous, right? So this sort of naturalist intelligence is also one that we can consider. So this is a more modern conceptualization of how we think about intelligence today. So what about our behavior? Well, this falls under the domain of social psychology, how we think about our own behavior relative to other people. So imagine a student taking an exam, right? So if this student got an A, what do they think in their own head? Well, we use often what's called an internal attribution, meaning the reason you did well is because something you did. So this student gets an A and he says, well, I got an A because I studied hard, right? It's due to me, it's due to my own effort. Alternatively, if this student did really poorly and got a D, well, now he uses an external attribution. The reason I did bad is not because of me, it was because of my teacher, right? The teacher made the test too hard. That's why I did bad. And interestingly, if we flip it, if we look at how a person perceives others, so imagine he has a friend sitting next to him. His friend, she gets an A. Well, he doesn't attribute that to her hard work. He'll more often attribute that to external attribution. She got an A because the test was easy. Alternatively, if she did bad, he will attribute that to internal attribution. She did bad because she did not study hard enough. So this is a way to sort of keep up our own sense of self, our own sort of sense of way we think of ourselves and our abilities. So if we do well, we attribute it to our own causes, our own drives and motives. If we do poorly, we typically attribute it to things outside of ourselves. And again, this is something that is all humans we engage in. This is a natural process that as human beings, we simply use, again, to boost and to uplift ourselves. So finally, psychology, right? We're also interested in not just, quote, normal processes, but what happens when that goes awry? So this may be through developmental changes or depression, anxiety. All of this falls under the rubric of mental illness. So abnormal psychology is the field that's really devoted to trying to understand the causes or etiology of these various types of mental illness, and then trying to devise ways to treat these individuals so they do not suffer as much. So when I talk to students, both here and in India and abroad, when they think about psychology, often they think of just this. They think of clinicians and counselors working with patients. And certainly this is an important component of psychology. And so clinical psychology is really concerned with the evaluation, the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness, right? So again, this could be anxiety, this could be depression, this could be psychosis such as schizophrenia. It could be developmental disorders such as autism or ADHD. It could be substance abuse. So there's lots of different types of mental illness that clinical psychologists are concerned with. And again, they're really there to try to understand the underlying etiology and ways to treat. Now, we also have counseling psychology, and our school is the School of Psychology and Counseling, so this is an area we will emphasize. Counseling psychology is also interested in treating people, but often they're not involved with the severe mental illness. Rather, counseling psychology is more concerned with sort of these everyday problems and struggles that we all deal with. So this may deal with a marriage that's having difficulty, or issues within family between parents and children, or maybe it's in the workplace. And so counseling psychology, more often they're working in either an individual or group setting in order to try to resolve these various issues that often arise. But the question is that all psychologists do? And I can say emphatically, no, that is not. There are many types of psychologists today that are engaged in psychological work, but do not necessarily consider themselves to be part of counseling or clinical psychology. And as I mentioned earlier, I would lump myself in this. I am a researcher. And so here's just a few examples. Educational psychology. These are psychologists that are interested in education, and most often they're focused on school-age children, so young children or adolescents. And they're really there to try to aid the children, trying to devise ways to improve learning, trying to work with parents to help children that may be struggling, or in some cases, they may focus on special needs. So children that are suffering from learning disability or other developmental disabilities. So trying to aid those children to gain the best education that they can. Industrial organization psychology. These are psychologists that work in the world of business and industry. So they're really there to help business devise ways to improve staff morale, to improve motivation. They may look at the way the office is organized. So they're really there to, again, work within the world of business and offer suggestions and solutions to improve work productivity. We have developmental psychology. So historically, this was really focused on children. Today, it really looks at all ages. So developmental psychologists may look at young children, toddlerhood through young childhood. They may look at prepubescence. They may look at adolescence. They may look at young adulthood or middle age or old age, which we refer to as gerontology. And so the idea here is that as human beings, we change. Our mental processes and our behavior change as we grow and mature. And therefore, developmental psychologists are really interested in trying to understand those changes in order to essentially categorize development across the lifespan. Social psychology is really interested in group behavior. So unless you live on a desert island, right, all by yourself, which I don't think applies to anybody listening to this, we are all social beings. Human beings are highly, highly social. And so social psychology is interested in trying to understand, again, our mental processes and our behavior and how they are modified when we're alone versus when we're in a group. And so social psychology looks at a lot of group dynamics. So what are our attitudes? How do prejudices arrive? Why do humans, we have this propensity to obey or conform? What underlies our attraction to the opposite sex or the same sex? What are the factors that contribute to why we are aggressive or why we show certain behavior within a group, right? The class clown versus the studious student. And it may focus on intimate relationships. That can be within a family or it could be within a intimate relationship. So a marriage or other type of relationship. Cognitive psychology is really interested in the higher mental processes. So these are really kind of the human things, what makes us unique. So they focus on our ability to reason, to process information, to pay attention, to utilize language, to solve problems, our abilities to, again, encode new memories and then retrieve them at a later point in time. How do we make decisions in life? And one of the more exciting aspects and one that has a lot of focus is creativity, right? What makes us creative? And so cognitive psychology is really interested, again, in these, quote, higher mental processes. Biological psychology is really interested in the biological side of things. So it focuses in on our genes, but also our brain. So all these things that we've been talking about, right? How does our development change as a result of changes in the brain? How do our cognitive processes, how do they emerge out of our brain? So again, as a biological psychologist or a behavioral neuroscientist, I spent most of my career studying the neurobiology of learning and memory. How are memories encoded in our brain? How are they stored in our brain? And so biological psychology is interested in all these other aspects, right? But it really comes down to looking at the brain and trying to understand how our brain regulates and controls all these various mental processes and behavior. So at the outset, I introduced this talk as psychology and as interdisciplinarity. And so I just want to define this as a formulation. Interdisciplinary means looking within various and across various disciplines. Now, to be clear here, psychology is interdisciplinary because we have all these different disciplines, right? As I've just been talking about, counseling, clinical, developmental, cognitive, biological, social, psychology focused on understanding personality, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also interdisciplinary because psychology informs a lot of other disciplines. And so psychology can inform and aid understanding in terms of art and creativity. Law, right? Why do people obey the law, or why do they display criminal behavior? Philosophy, there's a lot of overlap between psychology and philosophy, such as, say, the theory of mind, right? Our ability to recognize that other people have their own personal drives and motivations, right? It's not just you, other people are their own unique people. Economics, there's a field in psychology called behavioral economics. Why do people choose what they choose? What draws them to one brand of product over another? Education, as I already intimated, psychology can help us understand how do students learn? How can we aid student learning? And for those students that may need additional help in special education, what are the best approaches? What are the best techniques? Sociology. So if psychology is the study of the person, sociology is the study of groups. So there's a lot of overlap between sociology and social psychology. And again, psychology can inform our understanding and the discipline as a whole. So my point here is just to say that psychology does not operate within a black hole all by itself. Psychology is really a discipline, a science that can inform many other areas and many other fields of study within the world. So to finish up, I want to spend some time talking about a psychology degree. So imagine, I've got you excited and you say, this is awesome. I'd really like to study psychology. And I hope I've changed a few minds. And so the question is, well, great. What can I do with a bachelor's in psychology? Well, there's two primary pathways that most students will take. So one, you could finish up and go directly into the job market. Now, I do want to note that the image you see on the right here is taken from the US. So our bachelor's program is 3 years. It's not a 4-year program. So at the completion of 3 years, you do have the opportunity to say, okay, I'm done. I want to start working. And some students will certainly follow that path. I expect that a large number of our students will actually choose to go on with higher education. That is, they want to proceed and gain a master's degree or a PhD. So briefly, let me just introduce this. What's the benefit of having a psychology degree? Well, I can tell you that many employers really like and look for a degree in psychology. So graduating with a BA in psychology is a tremendous boost in your ability to find a job. Why? Because as a psychology student, right, you've developed the ability to listen. You have those skills in place. You have the ability to work in teams. You've gained the interpersonal skills. That is, you understand to at least some degree why people act and behave the way they do. So you're able to understand the behavior of others. As a psychology student, presumably you have the desire and ability to learn what can often be complex information. So you're able to learn and synthesize that information. You are probably willing to learn and gain new skills. You have a certain adaptability, right? You can adapt to the situation in which you find yourself in. Your ability to understand and perhaps offer suggestions on how to improve the workplace. And again, as a psychology student, you're going to work. You're going to try to understand these processes and apply them to the real world. So let me just take an aside and say that with our courses in JSPC, it's not just classroom learning. We will have practicums or practicals where we take that information from the classroom and we try to apply it to the real world. So again, that skill set is something that will be of value to employers and something that many of them look for. So with a bachelor's degree in psychology, you are then able to move out and work in the world. So here's just an example of 30 jobs. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll let you look through this list as I speak. So just to give you a few, right? You could be an alumni director, a benefits manager, a caseworker in social work, for instance. You could be a coach. You could be a correctional officer. You could work in disability as a policy worker. You could be an employee counselor or a relations specialist. You could work in human resources. You could work in labor relations or as a loan officer. You could be a personnel recruiter or a police officer. You could work as a technician for a psychiatrist. You could work as a public relations representative. You could work as a retail salesperson, or you could work in social services as an aide, a substance abuse counselor. You could work as a veterans counselor, a victims advocate, maybe a volunteer coordinator. So again, the point here that this list itself, again, is not going to be exhaustive. There are many other opportunities out there. But the point being is that with a bachelor's degree in psychology, you're really in a good position to enter the job market. Now, that said, your ability to get a good job, a higher paying job, is of course going to go up if you decide to proceed with a higher degree. So the question is, do you need an advanced degree? Well, emphatically, you do not, right? As I just said, you can enter the job market directly. But for many of our students, I do believe that they will choose to go on. And so it really depends on your ultimate goals, your personal and professional goals. So a master's degree, which is typically 1 or 2 years post-graduation, that may be sufficient. So there are many types of counselors, for instance, that depend upon a master's degree. Now, that said, if you want to go on and say you want to be a clinical psychologist, or you want to work in a university, or you want to do research, a PhD is more often required in those cases. So it really, again, requires you to think through what you ultimately want to do. Do I want to be a counselor? In which case you get your master's and you're done. Or in many cases, you may choose to go on for that PhD. So here's an example, right? You get your bachelor's degree and you have this opportunity to work. Here's some more of these opportunities as I just discussed. If you get your master's degree, well, again, you may work as an addictions counselor, a career counselor, a marriage counselor, rehabilitation counselor, or you may decide to go on with your doctorate. So if you acquire a PhD, you can work in a college or a university. You can then be a child psychologist, a clinical psychologist, a developmental psychologist, right? We talked about these already. A forensic psychologist, which is a new area which has really garnered a lot of attention. And so a forensic psychologist or a criminal psychologist is really concerned about working with the criminal justice system. So they may be involved in trying to understand criminal behavior or trying to understand decision-making on the part of juries. But a forensic psychologist, again, is another option. An industrial organizational psychologist. So again, you could get a bachelor's and start work in HR, human resources, for instance. But if you really want to move beyond that, a master's degree or a PhD is really going to be required in order to do consultation work, for instance. A neuropsychologist. Now, I should clarify here, a biological psychologist or a behavioral neuroscientist like myself is involved in research, trying to understand how the brain operates. A neuropsychologist typically works with people who have brain damage as a result of an accident or as a result of a stroke or some other type of damage. But a neuropsychologist is really trying to understand, how does that brain damage, how does that impact them? How does that impact their attention or their memory or their ability to move, et cetera, et cetera. Psychotherapists, so working with patients with mental illness. A school psychologist or a social psychologist. So again, all of these are viable options that would require a PhD. So as I said earlier, typically your opportunities and the pay associated with the job is going to increase based on the degree. So you do a little bit better with a master's degree, you're going to do even better with a doctorate or a PhD. So some of the highest paying careers in psychology, industrial organizational psychologists, neuropsychologists, clinical psychologists, as well as clinical psychologists. Now, again, just a clarification here, it says psychiatrist. A psychiatrist has a medical degree, an MD, okay? So a psychiatrist is not a psychologist. A psychiatrist has an MD and they can prescribe drugs. A clinical psychologist has a PhD in psychology. They're treating mental illness, but a clinical psychologist typically cannot prescribe drugs. One of the primary differences between the two. So at this point, you may be wondering, okay, you know, all this sounds good. I'm interested in psychology. And again, I hope I've converted at least a few of you. I've been studying psychology for 30 years now, and I still love it. It fascinates me to no end. And so if I've kind of got you excited and you say, yeah, I'm really interested, I'd like to proceed with a bachelor's and then maybe move on with a master's or a PhD. But how do I know, right? How do I choose? Well, ultimately, you know, those are decisions you'll have to make on your own or consultation with friends and family. But, you know, here's a little rubric to maybe help you along the way. So first, you have to know yourself, right? So over the course of 3 years at JSPC, you're going to be exposed to a lot of core psychology courses. So when you graduate, you're really going to know psychology well. And I'll just mention real quick in passing that we're going to have all of our students take what we call core courses. At the end of the second year, you will then choose a specialization. We're calling it a track of study. And we have 3 of those. So we have experimental forensic, second is counseling education, and third is industrial organization. So based on your chosen track of study during your 3rd year, you're now going to take courses specific to that track of study. So this allows our students then to personalize, to individualize their own education based again on their own personal professional goals and ultimately what they want to do. So over the 3 years, you're going to find out what you're good at, right? Now you may start thinking, oh, I'm really interested in social psychology or biological psychology. But as you move forward, you may find that, you know, I like it, but I don't love it. What I really like is X, Y, or Z. So again, part of the process, part of being a student is trying to figure out what you like, what gets you excited, right? What do you want to do? Because ultimately, a career is going to last for decades. You want to find something that you love, and that's the top square over here on the right. Second, you need to identify the work environments that appeal to you, right? So what does that mean? Well, what do you want to do? Right? Do you want to do research or do you want to work with people, maybe as a counselor, an educational psychologist? Do you want to work in business, in IO? Maybe you're really into sports, and sports psychology, again, is another field that's opened up in the last decade or so. And so they're there to help teams in terms of camaraderie, learning how to approach practice and the best ways to move forward. So again, it's identifying the environments that you want to work in. Second, understand your career deal breakers, meaning, right? What's important to you? So is it money? Is that what you care about most? Is it the ability to work close to home? Or maybe you want to go abroad, right? Whatever those long-term goals are, that will ultimately help you decide which avenue or which approach is best for you. And so ultimately, it's really finding the right balance between love, ability, and money. So again, over here on the right, what you love, what gets you excited versus what you're good at, right? So these are the disciplines that I really excel in. Maybe I'm not that great at statistics, but I really love personality or I really love psychotherapy. And then finally, what pays well? Now, for many people, pay is not the end all be all, right? But we all need to make a living. We all need to survive. So pay is at least a consideration. And so ultimately, the better able you are to overlap in our Venn diagram here, right? If you can find something that you love, something that you're good at, and something that pays well, ultimately that's a win-win. That's really the sort of the sweet spot that you may be looking for. And so at this point, I do want to wrap up and thank you all. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. And again, if any of you out there are interested, we would love to have you come on board and talk to us and perhaps put in an application. And so if you are interested, I encourage you to contact Ms. Simran Munjal. You can see her phone number and her email here. You can also go on to the JGU website, www.jgu.edu.in, and you can get more information about our new school there. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure, privilege, and it's been a privilege and a pleasure to speak to you all. And so thank you again. And I hope to hear from you again down the road. So with that, I will bid you all adieu. Thank you and goodbye.